everyone, welcome back to Alice and the Giant Bookshelf. Today's video is my wrap up of all the books that I read in the month of September. Hi everyone, welcome back to my channel, or welcome if you are new. My name's Alice and I have way too many books. And today's question is, did I make a dent in those way too many books in the month of September? I was planning to read hopefully lots of shorties in order to reduce the giant TBR, and nearly everything I had planned, in fact I think everything I had planned for this month, was from my own shelf. So fingers crossed at the end of this video in the giant TBR update we have a little bit of progress. It was a mixed month pace-wise, I would say. I read 8 books in the first 7 days. If you want to know more about that, you can check out my how many books can I read in 7 days video, which is linked in the description down below. So then after those first 7 days, I actually only read 9 books in the entire rest of the month. So yeah, it varied a bit. I have still got quite a few of the longer shorties still to read, and I might add some of those in October to balance out some of the Victorian reads. So I did buy some books this month and I thought I'd mention those first. I read some of them straight away so that they wouldn't add to the giant TBR, but I bought most of these books on a lovely trip that I had recently to London, and I met up with 2 brilliant booktubers, Jack from Spread Book Joy, who I've met up with before, and the lovely Sandy from Ms Reads a Lot, who I had never met, who came over from the US, and we met up. We had a lovely bookish day and some afternoon tea, and I did buy books. So I don't want to say that I blame Sandy and Jack, but I mean, yeah, I did buy books. I also received my Mr. B's subscription book. The books that I bought on that trip to London, most of them secondhand, were The Decagon House Murders by Yukito Ayatsuji. And I've wanted to read this for ages, ever since I heard about these sort of Japanese locked room mysteries. I read Murder in the Crooked House, and I've heard that this one is better, so fingers crossed for that. I found this in Oxfam and it was on my wish list, so I bought it. I also bought The Diary of a Nobody by George and Whedon Grossmith, which I was on the lookout for because I wanted to read it in Victober. So this has been added straight on to my Victober TBR that hopefully won't be hanging around for very long. And I also bought 2 books that I read immediately, one of which I've lent to my mum, which is Please Do Not Touch This Exhibit by Jen Campbell. This is Jen Campbell's new poetry collection, which came out last month, and I'll talk about it in the wrap-up section. And I also bought and immediately read the second in this Buffy the Vampire Slayer graphic novel series. This one's volume 2, Once Bitten, and this is the series that is by Jordie Bellaire, along with David Lopez, Sas Millage and Raul Angulo. And yeah, I'll talk about that in a minute as well. That was the books I bought. I also received this one as a gift from my mum, The Bloody Chamber by Angela Carter. I've wanted to read this book since sixth form college, so we're talking a lot of years now, and yeah, I've never actually got hold of a copy or read it. So when my mum saw this in the charity shop near her, she bought it for me, and I haven't got to it yet, so that is adding to the giant TBR as well. So I thought I'd go through those first, but the rest of the video will be all of the books that I read in September, from roughly my least favourite to roughly my most favourite, although there are several favourites this month. And before we start, I normally do my stats, and at the end I check in on the giant TBR numbers. So let's start with the stats. I read 17 books. That was a total this month of 3,898 pages according to Storygraph, and unsurprisingly 11 of those books were less than 300 pages and 6 were 300 to 499 pages. So that came out at 65% short books and 35% not so short books. I read quite a spread of different types of books this month. So I read 1 digital, I read 1 audiobook, 9 books from the Giant TBR, 2 books that were newly acquired to the Giant TBR, 2 rereads, 1 book was a book in an omnibus, the rest of which has not yet been finished from the Giant TBR, and 1 book was from the library. It's been a very busy end to the month, but not reading wise. So at the end of the month I did have 3 to 4 books still not yet finished and 2 audiobooks that are still on the go, and I think most of those I will probably talk about in the other half of my October TBR because they're all stuff that I want to finish off. We're going to go through the books now and start. Some of these books I did talk about in other videos. I made 2 vlogs this month, which is very unusual for me, so some of these have been talked about already, and when we get to those I will say where I've talked about them if you want to find out more. I'll try not to make this super long. So starting with okay books, my least favourite book of the month unfortunately was a reread, and it was Third Girl by Agatha Christie. Now I bet you never thought you would see an Agatha Christie being my least favourite book of the month, but Third Girl, I reread it for Christie Fest and this one proved pretty unpopular. It was my second read of this. I had no recollection of the plot line, particularly from the first read of it, and I would have to say that I read this really quite early on in the month and now can't remember it again, so yeah, that's not great. This is a later Christie book, written in the 60s I believe. Although I do like, to a certain extent, all of Christie's books, this one isn't a favourite, and it's one of the more sort of convoluted and more sort of meandering Christie's. Certainly not a particularly strong Poirot book. Probably won't reread this one again, certainly not for a very long time, so yeah, that came out bottom. The next one that was okay was I, the Jury by Mickey Spillane. This was part of this Mike Hammer omnibus, so I have counted it as a separate book, but I do have 2 more books within this omnibus to read. I'm still undecided whether to continue with this, so if you think I should carry on and read My Gun is Quick and Vengeance is Mine in this omnibus, let me know in the comments down below. If you think I should definitely abandon and DNF this omnibus, let me know in the comments down below. I've talked about this elsewhere in my holiday vlog, so if you would like more information about my thoughts on Mike Hammer so far, I suggest checking that out. The main thing I liked about it was really easy to read. The main thing I didn't like about it was I just didn't feel like there was a huge amount of substance to this. That was my main feelings on that one. Now heading into good books. My least favourite of the books that I thought were definitely good was The Word for World is Forest by Ursula K. Le Guin. I'd really like you to let me know in the comments, what do you consider to be Le Guin's best books, and can you recommend any for a bit of a reluctant fantasy reader like me, because I found that although this sounded like the perfect book for me, I found this to be very dense in terms of the prose and very difficult to just enjoy. It wasn't I didn't expect this to be a fun book as such, but it was really not that enjoyable. I've talked about this more elsewhere as well, so I won't say lots about it here. What I did really like was this had some beautiful writing in it, absolutely stunning, like images of planets and the forest. What I didn't like so much was that feeling of density. It's a very heavy book for a very short novella. The next one was Big Blonde by Dorothy Parker, and I enjoyed these short stories. They were a bit of a mixed bag. I've lent this book to my mum to see if she might like them. I wouldn't say that these were hugely my usual cup of tea. And again, I've talked about it elsewhere, but my favourite thing about it was that the writing was good. My least favourite thing about it was that some of the stories were too short for there to be any real plot to speak of, and I found the title story very depressing. Next up, we have Everything the Darkness Eats by Eric LaRocca. I won this book in a giveaway from Olivia over at Olivia's Catastrophe, and there were elements to this that I really enjoyed. It feels like a very, very long time ago now that I read this. I didn't find it that scary or gruesome, apart from that at the very beginning of the book there was a prologue in which people's heads literally exploded, and that was not a great start. I think probably the best thing about this book was that the characters were interesting, and I liked the way their two stories became interwoven, even though they were seemingly completely unrelated. This is almost like two separate short stories that have been very slightly woven together at the end. This had a great hook, and the main horror storyline was really quite mysterious and interesting, but I don't know that I loved other elements of it. I wasn't 100% sure that this was my sort of read, but it was enjoyable while I was reading it, apart from the exploding heads. So yeah, next up I'm going to say, and we're getting towards the very good category, I would say here. All the books from here on in were probably just about 4 stars rather than 3.5, but I was a bit undecided on this one. This one might have been a 3.5. So this was Wake by Shelly Burr, which was my pick for Shortyseptember, which was hosted by Scott from Gunpowder Fiction and Plot. And this is an Australian crime novel, and it centres around a disappearance of a young girl that has taken place, I think 19 years ago, and we're following the twin sister of the girl who disappeared and what her life is like now. We're also following a private investigator called Lane, who turns up and wants to reinvestigate her missing sister's case. Now, these two lives that are kind of colliding in this book, it was interestingly done. I will be doing a full review of this book, so I'm not going to say loads about it here. There were definitely elements that I liked, and this was extremely readable, but I also am not quite sure how I feel about the ending. So more on this in a review on its own at some point. But I did think that it was a good pick for Shortyseptember because there was some really interesting outback scenery. There was a real sense of the isolation of this location. Next up, I'm going to talk about The Tea Dragon Festival by Kate O'Neill. This is a sort of heartwarming sequel. I would actually say it's a prequel to the Tea Dragon Society. I find these books to be quite sweet and quite comforting, and I think I read this sort of in a gap between quite heavy reads, so it cheered me up and it was lovely to look at because the artwork was really, really nice. Yeah, I read that one as a digital ebook from Libby, and I will probably read the third one as soon as I can get hold of that as well. Just before we go into the very good category, and this probably was very good, I had a bit of a disappointment with it, so I'll tell you about that as well. This is the second volume in this Buffy series I talked about last month. Really wanted to read the second one straight away because there was a cliffhanger in the first one, which was called High School is Hell. I read that last month, and so when I went out with Jack and Sandy, I needed to get the second one, and I had earned that reward by reading 10 books from my TBR in between reading one Buffy comic and getting the next Buffy comic. I think that was fair, and I read it immediately. And this one, Once Bitten, I didn't think it was maybe quite as good as the first one. There's an interesting storyline to it. This is the Buffy comic series that I was talking about. It's set as though it's at the beginning of Buffy, but it's set in our time now with mobile phones and stuff. I thought this one had good stuff in it. I wasn't sure I liked the artwork as much as I'd liked in the first one, and that was confusing to me because I think it was a lot of the same artists, so not really sure, but I think I preferred volume 1 somewhat. My disappointment with this book really was that I bought it brand new, I read it, and I read it really, really carefully, but the pages are all coming away from the spine, which is really, really bad because I bought this brand new in foils in London and it is like falling apart already, so that's sad. It isn't really the fault of the book. It was a good graphic novel and I will definitely be wanting to read book 3. There was another cliffhanger. The main complaint about those books is the collections are a little bit too short, so you end up always wanting more. I guess they do that on purpose. So hopefully I'll soon be through another lot of books and I'll be able to get the third one. Moving into my very good category, I have lent some of these to my mum as well, and I'll start with Frenchman's Creek, which is at my mum's house by Daphne du Maurier. I read this with a lovely group of friends, which was Emily from Novelle Novels, Ange from Ange's Book Chatter, Gemma from Gemma Books. I think I talked about this one in one of my vlogs and said that it's not my favourite Daphne du Maurier. In fact, it's possibly my least favourite apart from her short story collection, but that is not to say least favourite in terms of I didn't like it, because I have liked all of the ones that I've read. So Frenchman's Creek is a really good book. This one features a pirate ship, adventure, and a kind of a bored noble woman in, I think we worked out it was like the time of Charles II. And yeah, it was a really fun story, I thought. And I really have loved how every Daphne du Maurier book I've read so far has been completely different. Although I think my order of liking would still be Rebecca at the very top, and then probably My Cousin Rachel, Jamaica Inn, then this one, and then probably Don't Look Now and Other Tales. I still think all of those are fantastic. I really, really enjoyed the main character here. She's very feisty and very like rebellious against sort of, I suppose, societal norms of the time and what is expected from her as a woman, as a mother. And yeah, she has a very interesting and exciting time, and I love the way that this resolved itself as well. I thought it was very, very interesting in the way du Maurier takes it on some twists and turns. So great book, really enjoyed that one. The next one was the audiobook that I listened to in the month, and this was The Word is Murder by Antony Horowitz. This is a series of books I've been wanting to get to for a long time. These are called, I think, the Hawthorne and Horowitz series, and I didn't really realise when this was recommended it to me ages ago just how much Horowitz has put into it about himself. And obviously it's fiction, so I don't know how fictionalized all the stuff about himself is, but it read as though it wasn't fictionalized that much, and I really, really enjoyed it. I also enjoyed that this was like a detective story at its heart. It had an interesting case that we were following. I really quite liked the detective, Hawthorne, although he was very grumpy, but he was an interesting character. I will definitely read on with this series. I didn't think that the mystery conclusion was perhaps 100% satisfying, but it was a really good read. I thought the audiobook was really well done and the narrator was well matched to the book. And yeah, I want to read more of Hawthorne and Horowitz for sure. I also have already mentioned in another video Ghostly Stories by Celia Fremlin. This was a collection of 2 short stories by Celia Fremlin. I definitely want to get hold of more books by this author because they were really well written. It was really tense and a little bit unsettling, really interesting stories. So will definitely return to that author. And next up is Love Me, Love Me Not by Kirsty Capes. I've already talked lots about this in my holiday vlog. I think that this is another great book by Kirsty Capes. She's just announced a third book called Girls, which I very much look forward to. This was great. It wasn't as much of an intense favourite as Careless. I think I liked the fact that Careless was in first person, so I really felt like we were in Bess's life a lot. This one is not in first person, but I did feel a lot of sympathy with Lucy, the main character, even though she is quite an unlikable main character, particularly to begin with. But I felt like we had certain things in common that I feel like I haven't seen dealt with on the page that often. So I did enjoy that element to this, and I thought that this was a really great story. I just couldn't stop reading it or put it down when I had this one on holiday. It's very close to also being a favourite of the month, but I had 5 books that I actually did give 5 stars to, and I didn't quite give this one 5 stars. So very close for Love Me, Love Me Not, but not quite a favourite of the month. Into my favourites of the month, we have 5, and all 5 of these I gave 5 stars to, although when I looked back on it, I did think, have I been too generous giving all of these books 5 stars? But actually they were really good books, and I felt like giving them 5 stars at the time. So the first one is To Be Taught If Fortunate by Becky Chambers. I thought this was absolutely excellent, a great novella. This did exactly what I want from a novella. It told me like a full story, but in a short space of pages. And I was really interested in all the characters. I was interested in the way Becky Chambers had set this up. I was interested in the science. I thought that this was a really gripping read and a really interesting read, and I definitely want more from Becky Chambers. This was absolutely fantastic. I think she's a great author. I probably enjoyed this even more than A Long Way to a Small Angry Planet, although I did love both. Another favourite of the month was Prophet Song by Paul Lynch, which I read from the library. This is currently on the Booker Prize shortlist. I would be not at all surprised if this won the Booker Prize. It's a book that definitely does a lot of things I think prizes tend to look out for, among which is the style of it, which includes quite long sentences, big blocks of text, no speech punctuation whatsoever. However, the further and further I got into this book, none of those things are things I like, by the way. The further I got into this book, the more I realised that this style of writing made complete sense for this book, for this story that was being told. I thought it was really harrowing. I thought it was very emotional. It took me several days at least to recover from reading this book, but I thought it was brilliant. Definitely a 5-star read for me. Yeah, I have fully reviewed this elsewhere, so go and check that out if you want to hear more of my rambling thoughts about it, but absolutely a favourite of the month. Next up, we have another sort of fantasy sci-fi-ish type book. Quite a few of these are favourites this month. So this was The Fifth Season by N.K. Jemisin, another fantasy book, that I've given 5 stars to. I was originally recommended this by Gemma from Gemma Books, and I've wanted to read it ever since then because I heard it was dystopian and quite apocalyptic, and I really wanted to read it for the longest time. I was given this copy by Charlie from Charlie Book Reads, which was very lovely of her, and I read this on holiday. I absolutely consumed it. It's such a good read. If you are not a fan of fantasy, and like me maybe not a fan of lots of different names and weird words, this has all of that, but you can still get your head around it, is what I would say. And I really loved this. I need to get hold of the Obelisk Gate because I wanted to buy it when I was out with Jack and Sandy, but I felt like I'd already bought too much, so I didn't buy it, but that might be a treat to myself someday soon. So yeah, I can't wait to read the rest of this trilogy really, really good read, and more about that in my holiday vlog if you do want to hear more about that book. My two very, very favourites of the month were Please Do Not Touch This Exhibit by Jen Campbell and Green Witch by Susan Cooper, which was another reread. So Jen Campbell first. Please Do Not Touch This Exhibit is her latest poetry collection. I hadn't actually read any poetry from Jen Campbell before. I'd read two of her non-fiction books about weird things customers say in bookshops, which I find hilarious and love, and I'd read her sort of folklore-ish twisted fairy tales from other cultures illustrated book, The Sister Who Ate Her Brothers, which is a really, really good book. I'm yet to read Jen's other poetry and her short stories, which I really, really want to get to even more now I've read Please Do Not Touch This Exhibit. So sadly I don't have this here to hold up because I lent it immediately to my mum, pressed it on her and said, you need to read this. I find it quite difficult to have the words for this collection. It's another one that has elements that really spoke to me because Jen Campbell sort of weaves in that sort of imagery of the sea and imagery of the woods into what is essentially mainly about experiences in hospital. And the hospital side of things did speak to me. It was a very, very emotional book. It feels very, very honest and very autobiographical of Jen's experiences. Yeah, I thought it was beautifully, beautifully done. The writing of this poetry was incredible. What made this really, really poignant as well was the snippets from hospital letters, extracts from hospital letters that Jen Campbell includes between the poetry. There was also a poem in the middle of this book about a doctor that just made me have so much rage. So it's a collection that for me inspires a lot of different feelings, and I really did enjoy Jen's use of imagery and interweaving of layers. I'm sure there is a lot more to get out of that collection for me. I will definitely read it again. I can't pretend that I understood every single thing on a first reading, mainly because it was a first reading where I just consumed the book. Definitely poetry that I will revisit and feel like I will revisit again and again, which with a poetry collection is actually a lot of what I look for. I like to be able to go back to something and read it again and see new things that I missed before and unpack it a bit. So yeah, I need to think about my thoughts about that one a bit more, but thought it was an outstanding poetry collection. Finally, we come to my other favourite of the month, Green Witch by Susan Cooper. If you were here last month, you'll know I read the first two in this series last month, and that was Oversea Under Stone and The Dark is Rising. This series of books is named after the second book in the series, The Dark is Rising, but it starts with Oversea Under Stone, then The Dark is Rising. Green Witch is the third book, and I thought that Green Witch combines the best of both worlds of the first two books. We have the characters coming together, we have a great location in that we're back in Cornwall in the setting of the first book. And I know, because I've read this book before, this series before, that this series only gets better from here on in. So I cannot wait to read the final two, The Grey King and Silver on the Tree. I can't wait to read some more from this world. Absolutely love it. If you haven't heard of the Dark is Rising series, I talk about it a lot. There will be a video coming when I've finished all 5 again this time around, because it's just probably my favourite series of all time. I do not understand why this book series is not more talked about. It's a perfect series to read, I think, probably as like a 12-13-year-old, maybe as an 11-year-old and outside. Yeah, these are great. They get really, really dark, but yes, fantastic. The first time I read these, my mum read them to us as children. This is my second time reading it myself. This is a buddy read this time with Jack from Spread Book Joy and Gemma from Gemma Books, and I cannot wait to introduce those two to the final two books in this sequence of amazing books. No change from last month. We're still on this series and it's still favourite of the month. That was all the books. All that remains is to check in with the giant TBR numbers. Now, I was on 166 books on my giant TBR at the end of August in that video. I then received a book from Mr. B's, which makes it 167. My mum bought me a book, 168. I then hauled 4 on my trip with Jack and Sandy, but I immediately read 2, so only 2 are adding to the giant TBR, which takes us to 170 books. I then read 9 books from the giant TBR, which were The Word for World is Forest, Big Blonde, Everything the Darkness Eats, Ghostly Stories, Frenchman's Creek, To Be Taught If Fortunate, The Fifth Season, Love Me Not, and Wake, which I am very, very happy to say brings me down to 161 books on the giant unread TBR. My big major goal for the year was to get down to at least 150 books on the giant TBR, and preferably to stay firmly below 150 books on the giant TBR. So I'm really hoping to get down into the 150s next month. I'm really hoping not to buy too many and to just keep knocking that number down, because come December I don't want to be in a situation where getting a book for Christmas makes it go back up over 150. So 161, we are making progress. Maybe didn't read as many shorties as I would have hoped, but hopefully I can squeeze some more of those into October. That's all for all the books that I read in September. I hope you've enjoyed this wrap up, and if you have, I hope that you will give it a like. I hope you'll consider subscribing if you haven't already, and I would love for you to let me know in the comments down below, what were your favourites of the month in September? Did you have any books that you didn't get on so well with? Let me know all of your bookish news from September in the comments and we can have a chat. That's all from me today. Thanks for watching, and I hope you will join me again very soon for another video all about books here on Alice and the Giant Bookshelf. Bye for now.